But first, let us relax and turn to our speaker, Tim Brown. Welcome, Tim. And Tim, you prepared for us a short introduction on your new book, Sixties Europe.
Right. Thanks so much for the kind introduction. Thanks for hosting this get together around the book. Yeah, so, as mentioned, I've been working primarily on Germany, West Germany mostly, but also a little bit East Germany. And in some of the edited volumes that Jeroen mentioned, I also dealt with Europe more generally. But largely, I've been working on the 60s in West Germany over the last few years. And my editor at Cambridge, Michael Watson, who I outlasted, and I have a new editor at Cambridge because it took a while to do this book. He had suggested that I do a book on 60s Europe, sort of to branch out from Germany, and so I agreed to do that. And I guess there were three things I really wanted to accomplish with this book. First of all, I wanted to write across the East-West divide in a new way. I mean, this is changing, but it's been the case that Eastern and Western Europe, or capitalist and state socialist Europe, have been dealt with kind of as separate things or as parallel developments that only imperfectly fit together. And I wanted to get away from that. And so, I support this turn that's been happening in the scholarship to take seriously the emancipatory understandings of the socialist project that was taking place within the state socialist societies in the East Bloc. So in that respect, in this book, I look at the 1960s in the East, or 1968 in the East, as an attempt to find a way forward to socialism, not an attempt to escape into liberal democracy and re-embrace capitalism. Second main thing I wanted to do was to continue down a path that I'd been going in my previous work, which is to demonstrate the inseparability of radical politics and radical culture around 1968, to show that the cultural revolution of the 60s is inseparable from the political revolution. And I focused heavily on this on my last on my West Germany and the Global 60s book, looking at literature and music and other areas of the arts and culture in their relationship to the radical political movement that was going on. And the second piece of that is I wanted to continue to demonstrate the importance of a transnational and global approach, which traces the movement of ideas and activists across borders. So this book very much follows from the previous book in the way that it examines the interplay between politics and culture and the importance of tracing the movement of ideas and activists across borders. And then the third main thing I wanted to do with the book was to break out of this 1968 as a turning point narrative. Many of you know, we typically use the year 1968 as a synonym for this broader swath of radical activity that takes place in the 60s. Gets started in the 50s, continues into the 70s, but we use 1968 to denote that often. And I really, and this has kind of been combined a bit with a desire or not a desire, but it's been combined with a tendency to think about this event of the 60s, or this event of 1968, and to emphasize its the way in which it's self-contained and disconnected from what came before it and what came after it. And so what I wanted to do with this book was to situate the radicalism of the 1960s in the long sweep of revolutionary history, to show that the 60s aren't just this moment when there's a baby boom, when there's lots of student radicals and they're interested in the third world and influenced by the decolonization struggles going on, and so that there's this unprecedented outpouring of radicalism. And if you and one of the things that comes when you take the focus off the Western democracies and really look at what's going on under state socialism, it makes it much easier actually to break out of this 1968 as turning point narrative, not only because the timetables differ from country to country, but because in the East, as in the West, they're working through, I think, a set of classic revolutionary dilemmas, ways of thinking about how to make a revolution. And this is sort of the second main point that I wanted to make in terms of this, in my point 3 of breaking out of 68 as a turning point narrative. I place 1968, the 60s, in a much broader history going back into the 19th century and especially, very prominent at the beginning of the 20th century of attempts to make the social revolution. And these attempts then and in the 60s were inflected by a set of revolutionary dilemmas. What's the relationship between authoritarianism and anti-authoritarianism? What's the relationship between organization and spontaneity, between the individual and the collective? And I argue in the book that these are always the revolutionary problems and they remain the revolutionary problems. So if we look at the 60s as part of this broader history, it makes it more important and it makes it more relevant, I would argue, in the present day. So in terms of organization, I didn't want to do a country by country approach, because that has actually been done in certain ways. I did cover most countries in Europe, in fact. I did East and West Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, Italy, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Spain, Greece, and Portugal, the Nordic countries a bit. But I really wanted to organize it more according to themes, which I do. And the through line in all this, the sort of golden thread, and this is where I think my approach differs from a lot of other people's, is I really wanted to focus on worker self-management, the concept of worker self-management. In some ways, this book is a history that's inflected by anarchism, or libertarian socialism, as it's called more in Europe. And not just anarchism with a capital A, but anarchism as a shorthand for attempts to do a non-authoritarian self-organization from below, involving workers' councils and various forms of self-organization. And so this is the thing that I really trace through the book, and this is one of the key ways in which I connect it to earlier parts of revolutionary history, or earlier points in revolutionary history. And I was lucky in a way in terms of sources, because I had access to a lot of stuff in translation that was a product of the self-historicization of the left from below, the way in which left activists actually wrote the history of the left and recovered past histories, and also wrote the history of other national lefts in real time. So for example, I could draw on the writings of the Czechoslovakian Factory Council movement that were translated by the Czechoslovak academic and advocate Ivan Svitak. I could, reproduce passages from the journal Propostu in Poland, which were translated by the British activist and historian Chris Harman, or the journal Student in Yugoslavia, which was translated by the American student intellectual Freddie Perlman. So the book draws on the sort of self-historicization of the left in a way that allowed me to write previously hidden left histories. So what emerges in the book is really a different history of 1968 in Europe, one that traces a different intellectual lineage, a different radical lineage than the one that usually gets traced, which often has more to do with third worldism, Maoism, and so on and so forth. And of course, I do cover those critically important topics, but I wanted to present in this book a history of a different revolutionary urge, and one that allows us to really think about what's going on in Eastern Europe and what's going on in Western Europe together. And so if you use this lens to look at 68 in Europe, you see different things, So for example, obviously in the book, I argue against the tendency of some authors to think about the 60s and the decades after that in Eastern Europe as a sort of increased longing for liberal democracy. I mean, I demonstrate conclusively in this book that liberal democracy or an attempt to overturn the socialist project is not what's on the table in the 60s in Eastern Europe. Very much the opposite. It's an attempt in societies that have gone a part of the way down a socialist path, primarily the one that stems off from Bolshevism and the Marxist-Leninist approach, to realize what's possible within the socialist register, right? I mean, that's what they're doing, and that's why what they're doing makes sense in connection with what's happening in France, for example, or in West Germany. And I think, I mean, this book was very much inflected too by much in the same way that I looked back to the revolutionary past and thinking about the 60s. I also had my eye on current events, and I think there are some aspects of the sort of radicalism that I describe in this book that are extremely relevant in the modern day. So first of all, one of the key features of 60s radicalism that I really highlight in my book in West Germany and also in this book is their media activism. So on the one hand, they're extremely concerned about the way that mass media corrupts popular discourse, the way it influences people's minds in a wrong direction, puts out false information that makes it impossible for people to make rational decisions about what's possible to do. And this is linked in the 60s in sense with attempts to create counter media and also sort of counter publishing programs that allow, from the left perspective, proper perspectives to be put forward, right? So on the one hand, there's this activism around media. There's an attempt to rediscover the past and past struggles, which is a perennial problem of the left. And then there's the question of socialism. What is the nature of socialism? And that's a question that as we know, we have again today, and it is much more pronounced than it's been in a long time. And now it's that question of what is socialism is sharpened by the climate question. In that, in my new project that I have been working on for several years, but was largely put on hold until this book finally came out, and now I'm working on it again in earnest, is a history of environmental politics in East and West Germany, and that book is really going to examine the coming together of red and green, right? Like the idea of the social, examining the socialist project and how that's refracted by the emergence of ecological politics, but also how it's connected to attempts to see the place of humankind in the world in a new way, like the emergence of holistic types of thinking about the place of humans on the planet and with respect to other species and the universe more generally. So that book is going to be an activist history, but also an intellectual history of ideas as well, using divided Germany as a case study. But those issues are present already in this book, which early in the book looks a lot at the peace movement in the 1950s and early 1960s. So again, I see what the 60s are as something relatively capacious. So I think maybe I'll stop there and we can move on to questions.
Excellent, Tim. Well, thank you for giving us this overview and also sharing some ideas on the new book project that you're currently working on. One of the things, Tim, that we always like to do at the Institute of European Studies when we have an interview is to try to get to know a little bit the human being behind the scholar. And as we learned in the introduction, and you mentioned it yourself, this is not your first book on the 1960s, right? You have published on this before. And I would love to understand better why that is the case. Where does this fascination with the 60s comes from in your case?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I have a broader fascination with the history of revolutionary movements and the history of the left. I mean, my dissertation at Berkeley under Gerald Fillman was about the Weimar Republic and about the competition between radical left and radical right in the Weimar Republic. So I was interested then in the question of revolutionary identity and how radical movements are formed and the ways in which they think about themselves and present themselves. At a certain point, I mean, just in terms of pure personal biography, one of my dissertation committee members, Margaret Anderson, mentioned to me that no one had written a book on 1968 in West Germany, and that would be a good thing to do. And so she got me thinking about that. I taught a class on the 60s, and then I started working on this book that became West Germany in the Global 60s. And during the time that I was researching and writing the book, of course, several books appeared about 1968 in West Germany. So the novelty argument no longer held water. But I really, actually, that really led me to take a different approach in the book, because I wanted to get away from this idea of 1968 in West Germany being largely the birth of the student movement, in 65, 66, and some big events that happened in 67 and 68, and then the passage over to the new social movements and terrorist groups and so on and so forth. So I broke that book up in a kind of a novel way into chapters on word, sound, vision, power. No, let's see, space, time, word, sound, vision, power, sex, death. Those were my 8 chapters. And so then I had to think about how I could fill those categories. And it worked out very well, because it really allowed me to do culture and politics in a way that I think is interesting and holds up. And then, so I'm basically just like moving slowly through the 20th century. I mean, I've done, for the last 12 years, I've worked almost exclusively in the 60s, broadly conceived, 60s and 70s. And now I'm moving up closer to, away from 68 toward 89, but really still starting in the 60s with the green stuff, but focusing primarily on the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, interesting. Tim, before I ask the second question, let me remind the audience at this point, if you're in the audience and you have a question for Tim, please write down your question in the chat function, and then in the second part of the interview, I'll be happy to pass on the question to Tim. But one question in the meantime, Tim, I really need to ask you, since this is a conversation at the Institute here in Berkeley. One question I need to ask you is you mentioned Berkeley, right? You mentioned Berkeley in your book, and you already do so on page number 2. So could you share with us some information on the importance of Berkeley and what happened on the Berkeley campus to the global 60s movement, and in particular then in Europe? How was this perceived? How did it influence what would happen in Europe?
Sure. Well, I mean, the 60s in Europe are very much influenced by the 60s in America. America is very precocious in this regard. No matter how important the longer revolutionary traditions in Europe are, and I argue in the book that they're very important, in the immediate term, European activists were often working from Anglo-American models, and they're particularly influenced by the Berkeley free speech movement and by the emergence of student activists as new key actors on the radical stage, right? The idea that students and young people generally could posit themselves as people who could actually take action, right? So Berkeley was extremely important in that regard, primarily through the free speech movement, which is an early 60s phenomenon. And actually stuff was going on quite early in Italy too. I mean, the Italians were also extremely precocious in terms of student activism. But the emergence of SDS in the United States, the Port Huron Statement, and also the counterculture, all of that was extremely influential in Europe. And so there is, in some ways, a passage of ideas from North America across the Atlantic. So there's sort of a causative chain there. But in general, also, this is a transnational event that's marked by activists going across borders, new possibilities of travel, air travel, the new possibilities of mass media to see and experience things, in a more globalized way. But certainly Berkeley appears over and over again in the sources for the reason that it was a first critical event that inspired people around the world.
Yeah. Tim, well, one of the sentences in your book that really struck me was the following. Everyone, you write, was talking about cultural revolution around 1968, but what cultural revolution actually meant was the subject of heated debate. So could you share with us some of the answers that were given and which ones are most convincing to you?
Sure. Well, I mean, I kind of played with the idea of cultural revolution in this section of the book because, of course, the cultural revolution in China was something that at first gloss was appealing to many activists because Maoism seemed kind of an anti-bureaucratic, extremely radical, youth-fueled movement that could possibly be imported into Europe. I'm actually, personally less sympathetic to that strand of 60s radicalism for a variety of reasons. But so I was playing with the idea of the cultural revolution, but I mean, someone like Rudi Dutschke, the West German student radical leader, talked about cultural revolution in a different way. He used the term early on in the 60s to the idea of making a cultural revolution was an idea of changing consciousness, right? Like when they protested the visit to West Berlin of Moise Tshamba, the African strongman, they broke through police lines and kind of transgressed in a way that they would not have felt that they could do, right? Like they actually kind of like came to grips with authority in the street. And Dutschke wrote, "This is the beginning of our cultural revolution." And by what he meant by that was in the revolution in which we deprogram ourselves from traditions of bowing to authority and actually like take ownership of the fact that we can act and make change in the world, right? And then in parallel with student radicalism and in some cases worker radicalism, there's a radicalism in the arts and a radicalism of lifestyle. And so cultural revolutions here in the sense of breaking with old mores around, dress, gender behavior, comportment, sexuality, like all that kind of stuff, which we associate very strongly with the 60s. And then also, radicalism in the arts, which tends to bleed together very much with these other types of radicalism we've been talking about. So there's cultural revolution there too, in terms of actual like cultural production. And this is the other key thing that I emphasize is that, I like to get away from the idea that the 60s are about protest. I don't really like the term protest movement so much because I see these movements as taking various kinds of action that isn't reactive, right? And one of the things that they strongly do is try to seize the means of cultural production by doing their own book series, their own newspapers, their own all various kinds of printed material. I mean, this is pre-internet, right? So it has a very different shape than that sort of thing has now. But they very much wanted to like create new channels for the dissemination of knowledge, and that too is using culture as a terrain of struggle. And I think that was one of the things that's highly characteristic of the 60s movements everywhere.
Yeah. Tim, before I start passing on questions from the audience, one final question that I had myself is something you write in your afterword, where you have the sentence, "Today, 1968 still matters." Yeah. So, and I wondered if you could expand a little bit on that. I'm inclined to read in your use of the word matters, this important keyword in today's society, perhaps a connection to Black Lives Matters. But I would appreciate to hear your own thoughts. So in what ways does 1968 still matters to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's easy to look at the 60s as a dated thing because some of the stuff feels dated, right? Like Maoism, for example, or you know, like cultural revolution that seeks to establish things that we take for granted now, right? Like, changing mores around sexuality or whatever, right? It's like that kind of stuff that part of the 60s doesn't feel as radical as much as it did then. But the part of the 60s that's extremely radical still and is relevant is the question of what's the proper organization of human society, right? Like, how is human society to be organized? And we're very much in the throes of attempts to answer that question. And that's not just because, an organization and a movement like Black Lives Matter calls attention to the unfinished business in our society, and rightfully so, but because in the new emerging interest in socialism among young people, for example, and organizations like DSA and the Bernie Sanders candidacy and all of that, we're still dealing with the issues that were most prominently on the table in the 60s of how should society be organized, and is capitalism even the best system for us, right? And it's like in the 60s, the playing field was warped in a way by the existence of state socialism, which is passed down from the Bolshevik model with all the problems inherent to that. But that's such ancient history now that it's possible to do a fresher approach to the question of, what Marx was talking about, for example, and what is democracy? Because one of the things I trace in the book is the struggle for workplace democracy. And what does that really mean? What is actual democracy? Is democracy voting in someone who will then do what they want for the next 4 years? Or is democracy people taking the reins of control in their daily life in the workplace and so on and so forth? So I see that as the question and the highly relevant modern aspect of the 60s, and the reason why the 60s still matter.
Yeah. I think we have an interesting connection here, Tim, to one of the questions actually from another senior fellow at our institute, Chris Jackson, who also asks about parallels between current protest movements and the 60s. And then in particular, he asks, is there a book with the same impact now that is parallel to Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man? Do you have an answer to that?
Is there a book now that has the same
Yeah.
as Mark? I don't know. I would be interested in hearing what others think about
And is
this.
it still relevant to think about books as the main agency here? Because one could, in today's society, of course, think of YouTube and Twitter and what have you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it seems books don't have the same space carved out for them in terms of impact, right? And I don't know what that means in terms of whether it's possible for sets of ideas to emerge and take hold. But yeah, I don't know what book would be equivalent to that. The problems are slightly different now. I mean, it seems like we're so far beyond the question of alienation now, or repressive tolerance. I mean, it seems like we're rather than repressive tolerance, we're moving back into repressive repression in a whole bunch of ways. So I don't know. I mean, obviously there are many aspects of Marcuse that are important and relevant, but yeah, I don't know what the successor to that would be.
Difficult. Yeah, I see that Chris suggested Thomas Piketty.
Yeah, that would be someone in my list of people we could think about in that connection. Yeah.
Now, another follow-up question from the audience. Let me read it to you. The global 60s subfield emerged in the early 2000s, especially in the context of opposition to the Iraq War. How do you see scholarship on the global 60s intervening in politics in 2020? Are there other eras, movements more pertinent now?
Yeah, this is from Quinn, I think. Quinn, are you asking, are there other movements that are more pertinent than the 60s right now that we should be thinking about in terms of contemporary activism?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, I'm sure there are movements. I'm sure you probably have some in mind in asking this question, but I don't really adhere to the idea that the 60s aren't relevant because I'm still interested in socialist democracy in the workplace, which I think hasn't gone anywhere since the 60s. And so that's the thing that I argue for in the book as being the golden thread of continuing relevance, is like workplace democracy, daily life democracy. And I certainly invite you to put forward some ideas about what other movements we should be looking at right now. Yeah. Also, I want to quickly say, now that I'm looking at the chat, that someone suggested Capitalist Realism as a book that's very important, and I agree with that. Absolutely, yeah. That's a hugely impactful book.
Yeah. Very good, Tim. Let me maybe come to one of the questions before we go back to questions from the audience. One of the questions that I had myself when reading your book, and about this discussion, right, about the impact today of the 60s, and you elaborated a little bit on that, but you do also mention briefly in your afterword right-wing movements, right? And you say that anger about neoliberal globalization, you mentioned that this is today widespread also in right-wing circles, and I wonder, could one perhaps go beyond that? And what triggered this idea in my head was a drawing that I saw in your book on page 128. I saw a picture with the text, "Attention, the radio lies." And this idea, right, that you can't trust the media any longer, that you can't trust the government, that we have to stand up against the establishment. To me, it seems that in today's society, it's no longer just a leftist idea. You also see that in right-wing rhetoric. So would you then say that certain elements of left-wing populist movements from the 60s could potentially have influenced also today right-wing's populism?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a tendency on the right to mimic the social revolutionary content of the left. I mean, you see this already years ago. The left-wing fight song in West Germany in the 70s, kind of mocked für niemand, no power anyone, from the band Ton seine Scherben, and that was quickly adopted by the radical right, like that kind of stuff, like the left can't claim. I mean, this is an old thing going back. I mean, this subject of my first book, in a way, is like the fight over who gets to own the subversive symbols of opposition to authority. And the right, the ambiguous thing is that the right uses that social revolutionary content or social revolutionary set of appearances and gestures as in the service of authoritarian projects, right? Like there's this weird, in fascism, always this weird anti-authoritarian moment that's linked to authoritarianism, and you see that now too, in the global radical right. But the radio lies. I mean, this is a tricky business, right? Because the idea that there's a truth out there that could be assessed and put forward is what's central to the idea that the radio lies. I mean, the radio lies from the Atelier Populaire, this poster, is linked especially to the fact that the radio in France, like purposely and clearly, like gave a different event of a different version of what was really happening in street protest than what was actually happening. So activists could say, well, I see what's happening, what the riot police are doing, and then the radio says something completely different, right? Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of one-to-one relationship between social reality and its mediatic representation, which may seem like naive to us, from the perspective of 2020. Yeah. And I don't really have an answer to this. I mean, actually, Quinn, who's on this call, probably has a lot to say about these sorts of things, having written his excellent book Globalist, and I would say an expert on the contemporary radical right. But I certainly think that now it's a tricky business, because this is a way in which, okay, so here's something an opinionated thing I would say is that when there isn't actually a left when the left is marginalized or self-marginalized in a way that I would argue it has been in the States for a long time, it's easy for other actors to step in and seize the mantle of radical action. And I think that's part of what we're seeing now. I mean, I think that when there's no explicit emancipatory left bucket in which to pour one's impulses, then people look for other places to pour them. And I think that that's part of what's going on. But then this question of questioning the nature of reality now, I would argue, is something quite different than the relatively simple claim of the radio lies, right? Which is very almost, yeah, okay. I'll stop there.
Tim, let me go back to the questions from the audience, and I can read a question from Adam. How do you assess the ex-radicals, or even the ones who aren't repentant at all, and the retrospectives they have written on the 1960s? He mentions David Horowitz, who became a racist on the far right, and Tom Hayden, who up to until his death was a strong believer in progressive movements.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no extrapolating out from individual biographies, is there, Adam? I mean, I think that this is one reason why I've wanted in my work in the 60s to get away from focus on personages. You know, I'm not so interested in what radicals later go on to do, because I don't see, I'm not so interested in the generational model, because I see this as an evergreen set of problems and dilemmas about social organization. And we know that people have different life courses, and they change their minds, and they become old, or they become sick, or they have life experiences that convince them that they did things wrongly. Or, you know, many Maoists, for example, later went on to reject having been Maoists for obvious reasons that didn't look so good once the moment of widespread decolonization movements was over. And there's an uncriticalness of many people. I mean, this is a through line in the book as well, is that there are people who I think have it right, and there's people who I think have it wrong on the left, right? And I don't really mince words about that too much in the book. But of course, many of the people who I deem having had it wrong did repent their earlier positions, but they usually did it in kind of a neoliberal way or a anti-totalitarian way or whatever. But in general, you know, I don't care so much about what individuals do, because this is much bigger than individuals, and individuals are just data points, for, you know, in a certain sense, for me as a historian.
Tim, let me also pass on a question from an undergraduate student in the audience. Do you have any suggestions, he writes or she writes, about resources for students outside the field of history to learn more about the 1960s in Europe? And perhaps that could also be an opportunity for you to speak a little bit more about culture, about art, which you do also in your book. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I see someone puts in the chat, someone who I know well puts in the chat Martin Klimke's website. That's a suggestion that I would second. But yeah, I mean, there's so much out there. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about studying the 60s is that there's so many documents online. I mean, the whole, the 60s movements documented themselves, archived themselves, and historicized themselves in real time. And members of those movements have continued to do that, ever since. So you can find massive troves of documents on every aspect of the women's movement, or for example, or the gay rights movement, or, different flavors of different radical movements in different countries. So it's out there. And it really helped me in doing this book, because you find out over time that, well, I should have gathered this in the archive or that in the archive, and I could find so much stuff online already, right? So like, the primary documents are out there. It's interesting for me to think, because when I was an undergrad at Berkeley. I did both undergrad and grad school at Berkeley. I considered doing medieval history, and I later changed to modern history. And my relationship to the documents would have been quite different if I had been a medievalist rather than doing modern history. But I would encourage the person who asked this question to email me at my Northeastern address, which is easy to find, Timothy Scott Brown, chair of the history department at Northeastern. Drop me a line, and I'm happy to talk further about sources.
Yeah, Tim, another question that comes to mind is you point out that much of what we see in the 60s is also kind of a continuation of what we saw happening at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, with the avant-garde, with Dada, with modernism. What you don't mention, and that struck me a little bit in your book, is resistance movements against Nazi occupation in Europe. Did that play a role at all, or would you say that type of resistance that you could see against Nazi occupiers was not really that important to understand the 60s?
No, it was very important. I mean, I think I do say this in the book. Maybe it is not a forthright way as I should have, but the memory, the cultural memory of the resistance was huge in many countries. I would say generally, but especially in certain countries, like in Greece, for example, in West Germany. Obviously, it's absolutely central and critical. In France, in Italy, and really one of the things I show in the book, for example, especially in talking about Italy, is how the fascist personnel and structures are still in place, right? So it's not like, for us, the 20s and the 30s are so long ago, but as 60s activists, they were just the other day. They were just behind them as societies, and fascist personnel, ex or possibly still current fascist, personnel and all kinds of leading positions in society, and laws in many cases, and also student activists would argue structures of thought, right? Like there's very much this activism around how can we find the structures of thought that led our parents' generation to be fascist and to make sure that we don't reproduce them, right? But like alongside that, in parallel to that, there's very much an attempt to call on the living legacy of the resistance, and I think that this, is quite important. And I mean, and also there's a section in the book. There's a whole section in one of the chapters about the Spanish Civil War, right? Like that's one of the most important places where this coming to terms with the failure to successfully resist fascism and what it meant and what the usefulness of those traditions still was in the 60s. So no, I think that's absolutely critical.
Yeah. Let me go back to questions from the audience. I have another question here. Do you see or discuss in your book any parallels in cultural responses to the political upheavals of the 1960s versus today, in art or in literature? Any thoughts on that, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I think the template for a lot of what still exists today was laid in the 60s and 70s, although again, as Joan was just pointing out, I mean, that in a different sphere of anti-fascism, that's those older cultural approaches date back into the 19th century too. I think, I don't have anything specific about the sort of like contemporary cultural praxis and how it differs from that in the 60s and 70s. Although I would just observe that a lot of the things that we take as commonplace now were new and fresh then, and in some ways, because society is more permissive in the cultural sphere. I mean, I'm happy to be disputed in this, but I have the sense that well, there's two things I would say here. On the one hand, I have the feeling that it's harder to make a splash culturally in a more permissive society. our society and societies in the West are more culturally permissive, but the iron grip of the workplace and class relations is still in place. And so that's a much harder thing to attack. Having said that, I would say in our country, since 9/11, there's also things that are unsayable or undoable in the cultural sphere, right?
Mhm.
In the 60s, it was easy to get to provoke society, especially in West Germany that I've studied the most. It was easy to do something that was so ultra, that to us seems tame, but was very ultra in that moment. Um, so I don't know. I'm rambling on that point, but I mean, I think that's an interesting field of inquiry, right? Like how is it possible to culturally provoke, and is that the same? I mean, that's something that some thinking needs to be done around.
Yeah.
Sure thinking is being done around it and has been done around it.
Yeah. Tim, as a Dutch studies scholar myself, I was very intrigued by the passages in your book about Amsterdam and the Provo movement. And it also made me think about the new book project you're currently working on. And I was thinking on the whole idea of the white bicycle idea and ban the cars and kind of green ideas developing in the 1960s. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, on the importance that you see in the Provo movement in Amsterdam and to the global 60s movement, especially when it comes to kind of green ideas?
Sure. I mean, yeah, Provo was very eclectic and very precocious. I mean, they put things like cigarette smoking and car exhaust on the agenda very early on. Um, and ecological thinking is one of the things that really gets started in the 60s and blossoms in the 70s. And so it's the ecology movement and environmental movement, anti-nuclear movement are things that we typically talk about in terms of successor movements to the radicalism of the 60s. The Provos are very important because they're early, they're very early in what they're doing, and they're influential throughout Europe. They draw on older traditions, radical traditions, especially anarchism. So they're very much, the name Provo, comes from, provoking, right? Like to cause a stir. And they did these sort of media performances, if you want to call them that could really provoke society and with the idea of exposing the actual relations of authority in society or whatever. But they really were a model for a non-Stalinist kind of left that drew on earlier anarchist traditions, but critically fused them with the new youth culture explosion, rock and roll and like new ways of dressing and living, sexuality. And this is a characteristic 60s fusion, right? Like it was new then. Like that's the part I feel that's hard to get one's head around now. Is how the cultural stuff was so radical then that doesn't seem so radical now. Like a lot of that stuff's a given, but the 60s is partly marked by this convergence of the new youth wave and all the radical culture that was associated with that, set in the context of the global decolonization struggle and ongoing, attempt to deal with questions of socialist democracy and so on and so forth. So it's really coming together of decolonization, the youth cultural explosion, and a renewed student radicalism. That's what gives the 60s its particular shape and force. And the Provos are at the center of two of those things, especially the youth cultural rebellion and a certain brand of radicalism, in this case drawing on anti-Stalinist or anarchist traditions of radicalism. And to your point, doing that in the space of the city, right? Like making the space of the city the site of radicalism and thinking about how do we actually live, sort of like instituting a early and precocious politics of daily life, which is characteristic especially of movements in the 70s. So yeah, and they are just well known and they get around too. So that's part of this transnational moment of the 60s too.
Yeah. Having a conversation on Zoom is actually quite interesting, also because of this chat function, right? I see that one of our people attending the audience and just posted a very interesting link also to the Provo movement. But I did see also another question, Tim, a question for you from Alexander. Could you elaborate a little on how your focus on workplace socialism allowed you to connect East and West Europe rather than see them as parallel?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of scholarship that emphasizes the ways in which student radicals in the East and student radicals in the West didn't understand each other. You know, there's a lot of stuff about how Rudy Duchko goes to Prague and he's speaking his Marxist jargon and the students don't really, you know, connect with him or whatever. And I just found all of this to be missing the point, you know. If you look at what's really going on in Yugoslavia, what's really going on in Poland, what's really going on in the late 50s and into the 60s, in Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, you see an attempt to mine out the best socialist emancipatory content from their current situation and to look back into the past and really think about what is a humanist socialism. Well, I mean, this is what's going on with the new left or in the West already in the 50s, you know, the new left, capital N, capital L, right? And the new left more generally is this attempt to rethink what socialism is. And with respect to factory councils, I mean, if you look at the situationist emphasis on the importance of the Spanish Civil War and the workers' collectives in Barcelona or Aragon or whatever, and if you put that alongside the attempts of student radicals in Yugoslavia or Poland or Czechoslovakia to like connect with workers, but not just that, the activities of workers themselves in forming factory councils, which is a historic form, and not just factory councils, but councils generally, which is, you know, the Soviet, right? Like the whole idea of people self-organizing from below in favor of radical democratic reforms. I mean, that's what's going on in Italy. It's what's going on in Poland, right? I mean, if you look at this instead of the supposed lack of cultural understanding, or if you put your lens on, you know, well, I mean, third world radicalism was important for the Eastern European activists too, right? So that's not even the issue so much. It's just that there's an attempt to, I look at it like this: in the East, they went part of the way, they went part of the way down a certain socialist road, which was a dead end, which is decisions that were made, you know, in the Russian Revolution, that were made by socialist parties that became communist parties in the wake of the Russian Revolution, and the advent of Stalinism and the way that warped the whole thing. And these activists are not, you know, hankering to you know, have more TV sets or whatever. That's not what they're about. What they're about is figuring out how they can get out of this weird cul-de-sac they've gotten themselves into, and how they can actually find a humanist socialism that's worth having, that allows them control in their daily life. And I see that as the key thing that unites all these movements on both sides of the divide.
Yeah. Tim, I see that we're close to the end of our conversation. Perhaps one very quick final question by Niklaus, who makes a connection to the coronavirus crisis, and is wondering, will the ensuing coronavirus crisis somehow affect how the history of the 60s is written from now on?
Okay.
Any thoughts on that?
No, I have no thought on that. I mean, this is an interesting question.
It is an interesting question.
Thanks for this. I mean, I think you have an idea about that.
Mm-hmm.
We should talk.
Yeah. Tim, I think that in any case, we will have to conclude today's program. And let me do so by thanking my colleague, Julia Nelson, first and foremost, behind the scenes, who was very helpful. I would like to thank all of you in the audience for your questions and also for participating in the chat. That was really wonderful today. But of course, a big thank you to you, Tim, for your presentation and for the conversation and for the excellent publication. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you all for attending today's event. Hope to see you at future events here at IES. Thank you all and goodbye.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.